Hello and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker.
And we're in the room where it happens. And by that I mean my living room.
That's where the podcasting happens.
It sure is. If my voice sounds off this episode, it's because I'm slightly sick. So I apologize. Hopefully I can keep it together.
And hopefully you can keep the germs on that side of the table.
I will do my best. So we're starting off here in the room where it happens, as we mentioned at the beginning. We're going to see Hamilton and Burr switch sides in these next two songs, actually. Hamilton's going to be trying to talk less, and Burr is going to actually make a stand and choose a side and try to start moving forward here.
Yeah, this is definitely a moment in their interactions where you get to see some very important character development, because very early on you establish that they both want to succeed. They both want to be Washington's aides, and they both want to rise up in the battle. They want to take positions of prominence. And Aaron Burr's position is, I'm going to defend my legacy that I already have. I'm going to lie in wait and then seize my opportunity whenever it comes along. Hamilton says, I don't have a legacy to protect. I'm just going to do whatever it takes. I'm just going to rise up and accept whatever challenges ahead of me. And so you see that Hamilton is refusing to throw away his shot, and he laughs at Burr's advice. And Burr says, you need to talk less and smile more and wait for your opportunity to come. And so here you do get to see the colliding of their ideals. And like one of my favorite moments in this song is when Hamilton is actually looking at Burr, and Lin-Manuel Miranda does his fake Leslie Odom Jr. voice, and he says, talk less, smile more. Right. Like, for a moment, I actually questioned who was singing that, because he does such a great job of mocking Leslie Odom Jr.'s voice, but it's great.
And in the staging there, he's actually physically mocking him a little bit. He's like putting it out in headlines with his hands, and he's doing a bit of a dance with it to make it kind of like a mocking tone.
That's great. So before we dive too deeply into the lyrics of this song, what can you tell us about the actual musicality of this? What are some of the influences and the takes that they have here?
So in the music here, you get a bit more of that Jefferson style that Miranda gave him, that classical jazz style. There's a bit of a pop jazz, ragtime, Cab Calloway sounding influence to the music here. And then there's a bit of an industrial electronic beat in the background, kind of referencing new wave and Kraftwerk, things like that. And you'll see in this song that while Burr is leading the vocals, the music is kind of Jefferson style, showing this compromise between the two, showing how he's kind of going to Jefferson's side of things.
Yeah, definitely it seems to be the moment where you see the overlapping of Burr and Jefferson styles of thinking, where they both have that kind of that laid back, more wait for what's going to happen, don't be so ambitious and so lyric heavy like Hamilton. It's almost like Burr's looking at this and he sees that Jefferson's camp is the one that is much more like his own voice, much more like his own stylings, which is where he's going to go in the next song when he finally pledges an allegiance to a political party and he signs up with the Jefferson camp.
And Miranda said in an interview that he stupidly gave Burr a lot of the best songs. Wait for it and The Room Where It Happens are two of the best songs I've ever written in my life, and he got them both.
That's really funny. I like that a lot. He did, in another interview, talk about how he did go back and forth about whether he wanted to play Burr in the musical or Hamilton, but
right.
It just made the most sense for him to take the title character.
And I did see in the note that the song's subject resembles Someone in a Tree, a song from Sondheim's Pacific Overtures, a musical that Miranda has cited as a model for Hamilton in general.
See, I like Sondheim a lot. I haven't actually listened to Pacific Overtures, so I'll have to pull that up after this. Just taking us right to the top of these lyrics, let's just kind of go through this and track what's happening in this particular scene. So Burr and Hamilton kind of pass each other, and they have this little conversation before Hamilton runs away to have the dinner table compromise bargain meeting that they have. But in this meeting, Burr addresses Hamilton as Mr. Secretary, acknowledge his actual rise to power, his actual position, his rank in the government. He says, Mr. Secretary. Hamilton says, Mr. Burr, sir. You got the continuation of the rhymes that we all love here with the Burr, sir lines.
Right. Alexander is always Alexander to Burr, usually, up until this point. And Hamilton himself always says, sir, to Burr, showing his respect.
Right. So at this point in the musical, Lin-Manuel Miranda rhymes Burr, sir with General Mercer, which is a fun little history behind him actually making this rhyme for the musical. We read that when he actually went in to just write a lot of different rhymes for Burr-Sir, he found like Burr-Sir, well, Mercer. Mercer's a name. Maybe I can find some famous name back there that is the name, someone named Mercer. And so he went back and he was like, he found the rhyme first, and then he started digging. And what can you tell us he found, Vinton?
Yeah, so he said basically that he found this street, and he found that the name had been changed to honor a general who had died in the war.
Yeah, that's really fascinating to me. It's one of those backwards moments where instead of having the history in front of him and making a song from it, he had that lyric and in his mind, and he was like, well, let me find out what the history might be so that I can fit that in. And he's like, oh, this led me to another point of study, another point of research, where we see there's another little tie for someone whose name was Mercer, and he took that easy way out where dying is easy, but living is harder.
Right.
He died in the war. He had the legacy of being a general in the Revolutionary War, and so he was honored with the name of the street, which apparently I've not been on this street. I don't think I have, but in New York City, it's still a street that's there. You can drive down this street in New York City right now, Mercer Street, and you can remember what it was named for.
Yeah, he secured his legacy, as they say, and all he had to do was die. How easy.
Right. That's a lot less work. We ought to give it a try. So
yeah, that line always gets a laugh in the musical.
Right. One of these days, I'm going to sit down and just track through every single veiled moment of Burr mentioning Hamilton's death.
Exactly.
Because that is so intriguing to me, how he works in all of these little subtle hints at death. And it's definitely lighthearted here, and it's very heavy-handed as far as where that is leading us in the musical. So one of these days I'm going to sit down with it. If you guys are listening and you want to actually take the time and save me that time, go through and send us an email at contact@graphocast.com, and we will gladly take your notes and let you do the work for us, and we'll reference you on
anytime.
We'll reference that. But if you want to go through, that would save us a lot of time. This is a really fun moment, though, where they're just kind of going back and forth, and they're doing a little bit of, they're being jovial, they're being respectful to each other, and Burr just asks him, so how are you going to get your debt plan through?
Yeah, basically saying, speaking of legacies, how are you going to secure yours?
Yeah, that's a good way to put that. He is reminding us, as the narrator who's in the middle of this scene, he's reminding us what the big tension is, what the big stakes are. He has to get his debt plan passed, or he loses his job, loses his power. At this point, he has the legacy of being a war hero. He did go through the Revolutionary War. He had his command at Yorktown. He had his moment of shining as Washington's aide-de-camp, but that put him as a peer to a whole lot of people there.
Yeah.
This here is what we remember when we remember Hamilton. We don't remember just so much that he's a revolutionary hero. We remember that he created our form of economy. He created our financial system, and the things he did in the Washington administration fighting against Jefferson, those are the things that really helped to forge his legacy. And so this is the thing that will make or break Hamilton's legacy in history.
Right, and going back to that dying is easy thing, if you live past when you make your legacy can fall apart by you not doing anything. So the very fact that Hamilton's still alive, still doing things, if he would have died in the war, his legacy would have been secure, but he's still alive. If he just does nothing now, his legacy just falls apart, and people go, oh, Hamilton, he kind of faded away.
Oh, that's a really good point. That's one thing that George Washington is very aware of in history and some of his letters he's writing. Whenever people say, hey, you should go to the Constitutional Convention, hey, you should be in charge of drafting some of this legislation, hey, why don't you become the president who leads us through all of this? He often is worried that about two things. He doesn't want to let his country down, but he also doesn't want to ruin his own legacy because he already is well respected, and he's well aware of the fact that he is someone on whom history has its eyes, that history is looking at what you're doing here. And if he had a really, really terrible presidency, it wouldn't have mattered what he did in the war as much. We would have seen him as that fallen hero who didn't quite raise up to the bar that he was supposed to be at from the beginning. So his legacy is on the line, the stakes are high, and Hamilton says, the way I'm going to get this through is I'm going to finally have to take a page out of your book. The recommendation you made at the beginning of the musical that I scoffed at that said, surely you're joking, that's actually what I'm doing here.
Right, yeah, as we mentioned before, he kind of hams it up a little bit.
I see what you did there, that was cheesy.
And he kind of mocks him a little bit, talk less, smile more.
Yeah, and so this is the moment where Hamilton realizes he has to engage in the politics of it all. He can't just berate his enemies with words and with ideas and his creative arguments. He has to go through the political channels and wine and dine the congressmen. Like, as Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson mainly worked with the president because the president got to represent the country and he didn't have a lot of interaction with the Congress. But as the Treasury Secretary, most of the financial decisions were made between Hamilton in his office and the Congress. And so he needed the Congress to be on his side. He needed congressional approval, or else there would be nothing he could do as the Secretary of the Treasury. So their relationship was so interconnected that they had to be on the same page, at least enough for him to get past these basic backbone pieces for his debt plan, for his financial plan, for the Hamiltonian system as he wanted it to be.
And Burr brings up, Madison and Jefferson are merciless. And Hamilton's like, yeah, hate the sin, love the sinner, which is the old religious phrase, basically saying, I can hate what they do and what they stand for and still work with them. We can make this work.
And in case you're under any delusions, that is not a biblical quote. It's something that comes up a lot. And when I work in youth ministry, people are like, well, the Bible says, hate the sin, love the sinner. No, it was actually attributed to St. Augustine in some of his writings. And he's talking about how there's systemic sin in the system in human systems, but yet we still need to love humans. And so it's very misused today at times, but that's neither here nor there. Hamilton's saying, they're absolutely doing the wrong thing, in my opinion, but I'm going to try to take the high road in all of this.
So then Hamilton kind of cuts Burr off, kind of with I'm sorry, Burr, I got to go, but kind of like saying, hey, the adults have things to do. I'm busy. I have to go do something now.
Why don't you go to the kids' table, Burr? This is the moment where you see the transition of scenes a little bit, where Burr was a part of the action. He was a part of interacting with Hamilton. He was on stage as a character in the present, and now he has to transition again to being a narrator portion, where he goes in and he gives that traditional, like, you think of the, like, two rabbis and a priest walk into a bar. Like, that's the two Virginians and an immigrant walk into a room, and he's resuming that role of being the narrator of the story. He's no longer a part of the action, and that is the thing that frustrates him more than anything in this moment.
That's right. He does not get to be in the room where it happens.
And so he starts talking about the stakes that are out there, and he talks about how they walk in diametrically opposed foes. Madison is on one side of the table. He is so opposed to Hamilton's plans, and then Hamilton is on the other side, and he is so opposed to Madison's opposition. He can't stand the fact that they don't have a real plan of their own. He hates the fact that he has to work with other people, and Jefferson, at least in his perspective, and it's worth noting that the only correspondence we have about this meeting and this dinner is in the pen of Thomas Jefferson. He is the only person we have that wrote about this compromise and how it happened. And so in his own perspective, he was just the mediator.
Yeah, exactly. He was trying to mediate the truth between the two of them.
Right. So the leader of Congress and the Secretary of the Treasury, he said, I'm going to host this meeting. I'm going to provide the wine. I'm going to be the one that takes you through the negotiations, and I'm going to help you in your dispute. And so Jefferson had previously kind of talked about how he didn't really like a lot of the positions that Hamilton had in certain areas, but this was early enough in the first Washington administration that Jefferson and Hamilton's feuds had not cemented themselves to the level that they were eventually going to reach. So at this point in Washington's administration early on, there are some compromises that were possible that could not have been possible once the creation of the political parties had been fully cemented and the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians were fully at war with one another. So this is a key moment where some really important plans were laid that set the course for our entire economy and our entire system of government.
So continuing through the lyrics here, there is going to be a lot of food metaphors talking about the room where it happens. It's at a dinner party, so they're going to reference that a lot. And one of the ones here is,
here's the pièce de résistance,
which is dinner table wordplay, showing here that it's the main dish of the meal or an outstanding event showpiece. Also, it literally means a piece of resistance, a piece of opposition. And just another fun aside, la pièce means the room.
Oh, yeah. So lots of French wordplay there that you kind of have to dig into.
You know, Lin-Manuel is crazy and getting all this stuff together. I don't know how he does it. He's a genius.
So we mentioned on an earlier podcast how Madison, when he first grabbed Thomas Jefferson's arm and says, "I'm fighting for the South alone. Hamilton's plan is going to destroy the prospects of our entire nation and destroy the Southern interest. You need to stand up for this against Hamilton." We talked about how one of Madison's oppositions was how Hamilton's plan would affect farmers and soldiers early on.
Yeah.
And at that point in our research, we weren't really sure what that specific argument came from, because we were just reading that note in the Hamilton. We kind of made a mental note that we needed to go back and research it a little bit more fully. And so I have researched that a little more fully, and the best description I've found of the congressional debates around Hamilton's plan and the dinner table compromise that we're talking about now, the best actual summary I found was in a book called Thomas Jefferson and the New Nation, a biography by Merrill D. Peterson. So if you're going through and you're interested in how some of these congressional arguments played through, you might go back and pick up this book. It starts around page 400. It's a really long book. It's something that kind of takes you through the entire rise of Thomas Jefferson, all of his big moments through his presidency, and you get to see some really great things. But here it does a really good job of unpacking what it is that the Congress was debating. And early on, the Hamilton plan went through a lot of different forms because they had to go back and forth debating it on the Congress floor. Not everything could be settled in committees, and so they had to deal with a bunch of different ideas and went back and forth. One of the early drafts that made Madison really, really, really mad was that Hamilton wanted to treat all creditors the same. And what that meant was that a lot of the loans that we were assuming as the federal government were going to be paid back to farmers originally, or to soldiers, and to people who were just local landowners and farmers, people that were kind of just the common average Joe person in the American colonies. And he saw that those people held the mortgages originally. They held the loans and the credit to begin with. But because of the rise and the fall of the actual financial system, and as we create a new government, those mortgages, those loans are worth a lot more money, and so a lot of farmers and soldiers had sold off their actual loans, and so they had assigned them to these assignees who were basically taking care of the interest on their behalf now. They were no longer a part of it, and so a quarter of the original lenders still had their notes, and about 3/4 of the notes had been assigned to other parties. And Madison was upset because he thought that we needed to show a higher privilege to the farmers and to the soldiers and honor their notes more highly than those who had just tried to engage in speculation by selling their notes to someone else or buying up all of these notes. And so a lot of people, a lot of big companies or richer parties had gone out and bought from these soldiers, from these landowners and these farmers, had bought their notes that they held up for a really cheap amount of money, saying, "You don't know what these are going to be worth later on, so I'll buy those actual loans, I'll hold on to them, and I'll give you a little bit of what it's worth so that you can have some cash now because you don't know what it's looking like later." So Madison was upset that it would be discriminatory against those original holders of the mortgage. He wanted to make sure that we didn't reward people who are engaging in basically exploiting the poorer farmers and exploiting the poorer citizens. And so there was a lot of back and forth about how we should pay our creditors, how we should assume these loans and assume the debts. And there was a lot of back and forth on the assumption bill. All that to be said, Madison was a huge opponent. Hamilton was the primary author, and so now they're here in this room trying to figure it all out, and after a few months of this happening on the congressional floor, the new bill that Madison cares about a lot is called the Residency Bill, and that has to do with where the capital of the United States will be placed.
And that's going to be the central argument here, that they're going into this room to decide, and Burr sets it up. He says they go into the room, and no one knows what happens in that room. No one else was in the room where it happened. And no one knows how the sausage gets made, which is an old phrase to refer to how politics are done. It was actually first coined by John Godfrey Sachs, saying, "Laws, like sausages, cease to inspire respect in proportion as we know how they are made."
Right. So if you want to continue eating your meat, do not look up a documentary about how sausage is made. It will gross you out. It's not the only reason I'm a vegetarian now, but just for your own sake, if you want to keep eating that, don't look it up.
Which is basically saying, hey, if you know what happens in these rooms, sometimes you won't necessarily like the outcome. Sure, the outcome might sound fine, but if you look into the devious settings of them bargaining with the fate of your country, it might look a little darker and be a little less appetizing.
Yeah, and that's actually the perspective a lot of people have about American politics, and probably international politics as well. They're like, it'll get done. We just assume that it happens somehow and someone's going to do the job. We don't want to look into what is really happening behind the scenes, what is actually going on in the congressional circles, what is happening in those committees. We don't want to know what the bill actually says. We just want to assume that it gets done. Someone's going to take care of it.
Exactly.
And so it's like out of sight, out of mind. No one really knows what's happening there and what bargains are being built. And that may be one of the reasons why certain shows like West Wing and House of Cards are so intriguing to us.
Exactly,
because
yeah.
it highlights that intriguing area of mystery behind the politics that is not really what we're able to engage with on the public level.
So Thomas claims, and that's an important lyric because as we mentioned before, the only surviving account we have of what occurred at this dinner table bargain is Thomas Jefferson's own. So we only get his side of the argument. So Thomas claims, and he says that Hamilton basically comes to him in distress, trying to figure out what to do. And Thomas here is going to rise up to the occasion. I'll mediate. I'll fix all of this. Remember, history depends on who lives, who dies, who tells your story.
And here Thomas tells a very unflattering story about Alexander. And so the basic story he tells when you read Jefferson's account, he writes that Hamilton was so exhausted, so exasperated about this. He thought that the future of the country depended on whether this plan passed, and so many people were actively working against it. He's talking about it, and he tries to act like he doesn't understand a lot of things, like he didn't know what was happening in the plan. When you read Jefferson's account, he's like, I felt like the Hamilton was blindsiding me because I didn't want this plan to pass. I didn't want this to do this. So he paints Hamilton as this guy that duped him into allowing the compromise to happen.
Yeah.
Jefferson was a smarter guy than that.
Right.
He was aware of what was happening in politics. He was informed. He was very engaged. He heard all of Madison's arguments as well as Hamilton's arguments. And so he wasn't someone that was just totally blindsided by this and duped by Hamilton. But, I mean, when he talks about it, he says that Hamilton was going on and just barraging Jefferson with all these ideas that were fake or not true. He said he pathetically painted the temper into which the legislature had been wrought, how angry they were debating about his plan. And he says the disgust of those who are called the creditor states, how many of the states were angry at him. And he's talking about the danger of the succession of the members and the separation of the states. So Hamilton is sitting there, and according to Jefferson's account, he's like, if we don't pass then states are going to leave the Union. People are going to run away, and the unity of this entire American experiment, the unity of our plan as the United States, depends on this passage. And so Jefferson's like, well, yeah, I'm in favor of the states staying in the Union, so maybe we should pass Hamilton's plan, give it a fair voice. And so later on, he actually paints this as the worst error of his own political life. Jefferson says, this is the worst thing I ever did, letting Hamilton get this through and being a part of this meeting.
Right. And the lyrics, he approaches Madison and says, I know you hate him, but let's hear what he has to say. And it's Jefferson that writes later that he was persuaded that men of sound heads and honest views need nothing more than explanation and mutual understanding to enable them to unite in some measures which might enable us to get along.
Yeah, that's very Enlightenment thinking.
Yeah.
That is the European Enlightenment coming here, in the idea that if you take scientific, rational modern people and put them in a room and let them think rationally about a subject, they'll ultimately see the objective good and the objective truth of what is real. If you think about it hard enough and rationally enough, then two smart people are going to come to the same conclusion. So you see this Mr. Age of Enlightenment is giving us that Enlightenment era idea that he says, like, if we're rational about this, come on, we'll get to the end of this and what really is important. And so he is playing this like mediator, sly, little cunning person where you hear in his voice the fact that he is probably lying to you on stage.
Yeah.
Like, he's probably painting himself in this beautiful way to say, hey, I know you hate him, but let's hear what he has to say. I'm being the rational one. I'm being the kind.
I'm the one above this argument here.
Right. And so he sees that he is the mediator. He's the one that is respectful, and the others are just doing the bickering like children.
Yeah. And so lyrically here it says Madison is grappling with the fact that not every issue can be settled by a committee. And Robbie touched on this a second ago. Madison struggled with true democracy. He worried that if everyone had an equal say, that the majority would trespass on the rights of the minority. And he was right to be fearful of that, because we have that problem kind of today in modern politics.
Right, and so that has to do with a lot of the fact that like the bigger groups were going to trample over the rights of the smaller individual farmers and the creditors there. So he was afraid that majority in a democracy where majority rules, he thought that then the minority wouldn't be represented. The minority would not be given their fair share of representation. And he thought the role of a democracy needs to be letting the minorities have their voice.
Right. So as Robbie was talking about, they're trying to figure out where to put the capital. Congress is fighting over where to put the capital. And when they say that in the musical, Burr mentions that the whole company screams in this chaos, and they're actually screaming out names of the 13 colonies, like where they're from, like put it here, put it here. And a tweet that Lin-Manuel Miranda put out said, I told them to scream names of 13 colonies. Lord knows if they listened to me.
Yeah, I've played that part of the cast album so many times back and forth. I was like, I'm trying to listen to like understandable state names or city names or something. Like, surely I'm going to pick. It's so hard to pick anything out there. There are times when the ensemble yells and I'm like, okay, I can pick out what they said. But other times I'm like, I'm just lost. So I imagine if I was in the ensemble, I would every now and then just like yell out my home city in Kansas or Oklahoma City. Do that.
Put it in Oklahoma City.
Right. This place you won't discover for several more decades. Oklahoma City is not going to be on the map for a while.
So in the lyrics, Madison here says how they're going to make this compromise, a quid pro quo, which just briefly, this is a good time to bring up. This song has, while it's jazzy and uplifting and happy, it has this dark undertone to it. Just a second ago, you saw these extra S's and yes and chess that gave this like sound to it. And the music in general at parts brings in this darker tone. You feel something sinister to this song, basically. And quid pro quo is popularly known from Silence of the Lambs, meaning basically give something for something. So the song has this really interesting emotion of darkness to it, hiding beneath this happiness. Like things are changing here. Things are getting a little darker. There's something sinister going on in the room where it happens.
So here you have the two plans on the table, Hamilton's plan for Assumption and Madison's plan for residency. So lots of different people were invested in the residency debate. There were lots of people that wanted the bill to be placed in one place or another. Burr obviously later on will say that he will present his own frustration with the way this is decided, but Madison says, wouldn't you like to work a little closer to home, Jefferson? And Jefferson agrees, actually I would.
Yeah.
And Madison proposes the location of Washington, D.C., the place that ultimately becomes our own national capital.
There was a lot of places put forth as to where the capital would go, and people wanted it to be in the north, people wanted it to be in the south. But of course, if you're putting it in the north, the southerners are angry. If you're putting it in the south, the northerners are angry.
Right.
And there was actually, at one point, it was put forth to have two capitals, one for the north and one for the south.
Yeah, which definitely was opposed by a lot of people that thought that it was a very fragile union of states at the time. It was very much susceptible to falling apart again, like they were afraid of when the entire union was starting out.
So Jefferson says, okay, if we do this, give them the votes. And Madison just says, well, we'll see how it goes. A bit of a non-committal response there. And it's historically accurate because, in fact, he actually voted against it when the time came.
Yeah, there are a lot of political schemes, though, that say, like, I will maintain my own opposition to it, but I'll also work to find 5 other votes for it. Politicians do this today as well when they're trying to whip the votes into place, but they're not willing to put on their own record that they supported it or that they opposed it, depending on the bill. And so they're willing to say that they worked towards the passage of it, but they want to have that little checkbox in the right column whenever the re-elections come along. So Madison does vote against it later on. But yeah, he essentially agrees in this meeting, presumably, that the Potomac River is where they want to place this. And Hamilton says, I'll support you doing this. Madison says, I'll support you doing that.
And then Burr says, no, basically saying that he's upset that he doesn't get a voice in this, that there are representatives who are not getting their choice in where the capital goes. They're basically doing this secret deal behind the scenes. And there's a bunch of people who should have a voice who aren't getting a voice in that, which leads straight into the company saying, one else was in the room where it happened, just continuing on without him, the way politics run on without someone.
Right. So when Burr shouts, no, that's one of those moments where I'm embarrassed to admit this, with as many times as I've listened to the cast album, I do recognize almost every single person's voice. But in this moment, it took me so many times of listening to this, I had to look up the lyrics again to see who was it that said no. I thought that was like Madison saying, well, we'll see how it goes, and then Hamilton saying, no, like I'm worried that he's not actually going to follow through with this plan. And so I misheard that the first several times, to be honest, that I was listening to this track. But it makes a lot more sense knowing that Burr is the one saying, no, I want to be in this decision. I'm not okay with the way this is going. I'm frustrated with the plans, the course of events. I need to be in the room where it happens next time. I'm going to make sure that I'm not left out of those discussions anymore, because I want to be playing the game.
Right. So going on, it says, "In God we trust," quick reference there to what we put on our money, the financial side of things.
And it's worth noting that that phrase wouldn't actually make it onto American money for quite a while.
Right.
It was like 1860s before it really was on American coins or anything like that. And it didn't become the nation's motto until 1956, so it wasn't really a part of the early vernacular, but it was a part of the Great Seal of the United States that was adopted during this administration, the 1780s. Yeah. And so it was around. It just wasn't as money-oriented at the time. It's just quite appropriate now, since they're debating money and the assumption of debts, and to make this reference to "In God We Trust" at this point in time in the musical, it's very appropriate.
Yeah, in God we trust, but we'll never really know what got discussed. We can trust that hopefully everything will work out okay. And then he says, "Click, boom," then it happened, just saying how fast this thing can happen, like the click and boom of a gun, like the shot at the end of a duel maybe, which is a reference that comes up pretty often here.
Yeah, someone on Twitter, I think, sent us a message saying you guys need to do an analysis of every time the word boom appears in Hamilton the Musical, which would be another great research project. Yeah. So if any of you as listeners want to send us a list of all of those moments that boom is used and the different ways it is used, that'd be a great, fun little interaction, and we'd love to dive into that on a future episode. But it is all over this musical. You see them in the Revolutionary War period when cannons are being shot. You see Eliza singing "He Walks In and My Heart Went Boom," and here you see the click boom of a gun. And basically, to me, in this moment, it actually symbolizes the fact that Aaron Burr has been lying in wait, waiting for that moment when he would be propelled to action.
Yeah.
And here he is shot like a cannonball against Hamilton's plans, against the ambitions of the Hamilton family eventually. We'll see that in the next song. And he's going to say, you know what, I'm fed up with not being in the room where it happens. I am out there. I am going ahead. I'm not going to throw away my shot anymore.
Right. So Burr says, "What did they say to get you to sell New York City down the river?" Which is touching on the origin of that phrase, to be sold down the river, about selling slaves down the river to the south. And here, the capital was sold down the river to the Potomac River.
Yeah, and you can understand why Aaron Burr, as a New York Republican, or eventually a New York Republican, but a New Yorker, is very upset that the New York City area is no longer going to be the capital. He's worried that he's not going to have the same privileges as he would if he lived in the capital of the United States. His clientele will be a little bit different as a lawyer, and he's representing different types of people instead of the people that are in charge of the federal government. So yeah, he wants to make sure that he has close proximity to power. He talked about proximity to power very early on in this musical when he was pursuing women and talking about how much that is something he values. He wanted to be near the capital.
Yeah, and Burr mentions, "Did you know even then it doesn't matter where you put the U.S. capital?" Kind of a wordplay there. Capital meaning the location, capital also meaning the money for the U.S.
Oh, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of it as the financial capital. And I like that this has a bit of a transition here where Burr is actively yelling at Hamilton to begin with. What did they say to you to sell New York City down the river? And then he kind of transitions back into that role, like gains his composure a little bit, and he's like back into the role of a narrator saying, or did you know, and this is more like the retrospective Burr, looking back on the moment, saying, did you know even then that it really doesn't matter where you put the U.S. Capitol? And Hamilton finishes the thought, because we'll have the banks. We're in the same spot. And Burr finally understands that he got more than he gave out of this compromise.
Yeah, Hamilton continues that wordplay a little bit too, because banks financially, banks like the river, the Potomac River, where the capital is actually going to go here. And like you said, he got more than he gave. Burr accuses Hamilton, who admittedly isn't pulling his punches anymore. He's fighting hard here. He went into that knowing that was going to happen, or hoping that was going to happen at least.
And he wanted what he got. And I like this interpretation here where he says that this is what I went into the meeting trying to get. So even though Jefferson is the one that in this scene is presented as the one who's trying to act like he's above reproach, and he's the one in control of the situation, who's hosting it all, he's mediating it all, Hamilton says, but you know what? I had that sly, cunning plan the entire time. What I wanted was to pass this plan. I didn't really care where the capital went because we still have the banks.
Right. And so you see here, Hamilton mentions you get nothing if you wait for it. He's okay with taking Burr's advice on talking less, smiling more, but he's still not going to wait for it. He's still going to move ahead and fight for this thing. He's got skin in the game.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I almost imagine that the contemporary Burr's looking at him and he's almost learning and letting these words sink in.
Yeah.
That he says, when you get skin in the game, you stay in the game. But you don't get a win unless you're playing the game.
Right.
So Burr was the person who had a legacy handed to him, and he didn't want to throw that legacy away, but he's listening to Hamilton. He's frustrated that he's not making decisions himself. He's frustrated that he doesn't have the power himself, and he says, you know what? Maybe I should stop waiting for it. The show-stopping number from the first act where he says, my philosophy is I'm going to wait for it. And he says here, you know what? Maybe that Hamilton guy knows what he's talking about. Maybe that's what he needs to do.
Hamilton says to Burr, what do you want, Burr? And he brings up that line again. If you stand for nothing, Burr, then what will you fall for? Bringing that back to where he got the advice from Burr in the first place to talk less, smile more, the Aaron Burr Sir song. If you stand for nothing, what do you fall for?
Yeah, and this is the basic big character arc for Aaron Burr himself. You see him as the hesitant politician who's very much ambitious. He's very ambitious, but he is lying in wait, waiting for the moment to pounce. And here he has that arc towards becoming more like Hamilton, where he's going to be actively campaigning toward the end of this musical. He's actively pursuing the thing he wants, and he's not going to throw away his shot, quite literally in the duel at the end. And this is kind of that turning point, that inciting moment where he is going to change that philosophy and start adopting more of Hamilton's characteristics. Early on, he thought, how is it that Hamilton's winning when he's doing things that way? Now he says, oh, Hamilton's winning because he's doing things this way. I want to start pursuing things myself. I want to be in the room where it happens. Next time, I'm not going to be an outsider.
Yeah, we get Burr's want. I want to be in the room where it happens. And this blind ambition here kind of cements his role as the antagonist here. It's going to lead right up to the direct confrontation with Hamilton and his own downfall.
And I love the way that the music kind of drops down for Burr's confession there, where they have this confrontation, the meeting, and then if you stand for nothing, Burr, what do you fall for? And he has that classic Disney Tale I Want song where he sings, I want to be in the room where it happens. He has this very sly, slithering moment where he says, this is what I want. My true ambition is being like bare to the audience. Is just completely naked out there for you to see exactly what it is that he really wants. He wants to be in that seat of power.
Right, and this might be a bit of a stretch, but personally, this kind of shows me the way he's singing here. He starts off singing slowly as the company sings a little bit faster, but he catches up to the company, almost as he's not willing to wait for it anymore. Now he's moving, he's catching back up. He's starting to catch up to where everybody else is.
Yeah, and when the company comes in and sings with The Art of the Compromise, and Burr's line is, hold your nose and close your eyes. It's like, I really don't want to do this. I really can't stomach this. Yeah. It's so hard for me to do this. It's so contrary to who I have been my entire life, but I'm going to just suffer through.
Yeah, another food pun there. As Jefferson wrote, it was observed, I forgot by which of them, that as the pill would be a bitter one to the southern states, something should be done to soothe them, and the removal of the seat of government to the Potomac was a just measure.
Yeah, so he's saying, like, even he had that pill to swallow metaphor, and he was writing about the dinner table compromise. It's an interesting way to read history, because we don't always have everybody's account. So here we got to see Jefferson's account of it. It's a really neat way that they remind you of how history is done in this song, to show you that you have one side of it and you're trying to construct the whole tale together. But here, the turning point for Burr is, to me, the biggest takeaway of this entire song.
And then we get this line, but we dream in the dark for the most part. And that's a T. Lawrence reference, kind of just talking about the people who dream in the dark, or the people who dream at night, don't usually act on those dreams, but the people who dream during the day act on those dreams. And this is important here because Burr is now becoming one of the people who acts on his dreams. And the whole song kind of leads up this, I've got to be in the room where it happens, and it ends with that click, boom. Burr finally decides to metaphorically pull the trigger, which will lead to a non-metaphorical pulling of the trigger at the end of this musical.
That's right. And so the next song kind of shows us the first step in Aaron Burr's political games, where he's not waiting for it anymore. He's convinced that he needs to shoot forward and take what is ahead of him. Yeah. And so in the song Schuyler Defeated, we're going to see that Aaron Burr is going to directly challenge Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law, General Philip Schuyler. And so the beginning of the scene is young Philip Hamilton, Anthony Ramos, running up to his mama saying, hey, look, Grandpa's in the paper. And he reads the newspaper article.
Right, and they read it, and the music goes along to the tune of the Schuyler Sister intro. We have the same type of music in the same way that they're singing here. And it says, War hero Philip Schuyler loses Senate seat to young upstart Aaron Burr. And we may not have mentioned this before, but Philip Schuyler was a general in the Revolution, and he was known for convincing a few native tribes to join the colonists. And then here, this young upstart Aaron Burr, not something you would normally hear about Aaron Burr, but as we mentioned in the last song, he pulled the trigger and he's moving up, and people are already noticing.
Yeah, and we've talked about a few of the things that Aaron Burr's done up until this point as a lawyer and as a prominent figure. So people are looking at him. Everyone that's talked to him up until this point has looked at him as a very charming person, a very charismatic person that can win people to their sides. And so they look at him and see that politically he is the right choice. We'll talk a little bit more about the political decision for him to challenge Philip Schuyler in a second. But I love in this moment of the song the interactions between Eliza and Philip. We've seen their tenderness together before, where they were practicing French and playing piano. Here you see that Philip is probably perusing this broadside, this newspaper article in the newspaper. He sees his grandpa's name, and he's like a kid who gets excited at seeing his grandpa's name. He's like, "Mommy, look, Grandpa's in the paper." And then he starts reading, and he kind of realizes, like, oh no, like this is not something to be excited about. And when he looks up at Eliza, he says, "Grandpa just lost his seat in the Senate." And Eliza tenderly kind of comforts him, saying, "Sometimes that's how it goes."
Yeah, in the staging, she puts her hand on his shoulder and like kind of embraces him slightly there.
Yeah, and Philip is worried. He knows his dad's going to be upset. He knows his dad's temperament, and he knows that his dad is involved actively in his grandfather's cause. And so he's going to say, "Daddy's going to find out any minute."
Yeah, Hamilton is not going to react the same way that Eliza does there. Sometimes that's how it goes.
Right. They have a very different response to Burr taking on Philip Schuyler and then running for that seat.
Right. And then so you have Philip and Eliza both saying further down, kind of, let's go down the paper, read a little further. But also in the staging here, they're on the second floor of the stage and Burr is entering on the first floor. So further down, you kind of pan your eyes down and see Burr coming onto the stage.
Oh, man, this is like an onion with all the different layers. So many things, many.
And there's also this might be a bit of a stretch as well, but there's also this tone of further down, we're losing quality by Burr stepping in and taking the place of my father Schuyler here.
Okay, yeah, you see that like Philip Schuyler is the one who has like a political, like he's a landowner, he's a aristocrat, so to speak, in their context. Right. And Aaron Burr is a little more of the upstart who had a legacy to defend, but it wasn't of the same level as the Schuylers.
Hamilton then comes in and says, "Burr? But there's no sir here," kind of signifying the animosity here and that they're now against each other. The friendship's over.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't noticed that this is his first time to ever address him without the Burr Sir respectful title. That's neat. So he asks him just the direct question, gets right down to it. "Since when are you a Democratic Republican?"
Yeah, which he basically says, since it put me on the up and up again, it helped my career to be one, so I'm going to be one. I don't have a personal motive. I don't really side one way or the other, but if it helps me, I'm going to choose it.
Right, and here I feel like you kind of have the integrity of the narrator compromised somewhat because he's been talking this whole time like he's above everything.
Yeah.
And here he's actively engaging in his own shaming. He's saying like something very self-deprecating in this moment that he lets the audience see, where he's saying, "Since being one put me on the up and up again. Like this is what's going to help me be ambitious. I'm being cunning. I don't care about the morals of it or the ethics or the political stances. It's just my own ambition. That's what matters." And so he's very bare and honest about that, which to me kind of took me out of the moment somewhat. Like I felt like Aaron Burr directly would be someone who wants to hide his motives, hide his cunning motives a little bit and be a little more sly about how he's doing it. But here he just outright says, "You know what? It doesn't matter. They don't need to know me or what I stand for. They just don't like you, Hamilton."
Yeah, just like politics today, a side can get votes, not for being what they are, but solely for being not the other side.
Yeah, and historically, the political climate of the New York Senate race was a very, very heated one. It was contentious. It was very personal. The political parties there weren't so much the same lines of parties that we're used to talking about in American politics. Even the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists were still kind of in flux about what they stood for, who they were, what they meant at this point in time. But there were three main families in New York politics around whom a lot of the party loyalties kind of swarmed and circled.
Yeah.
So you had the Clintons, the Livingstons, and the Schuylers, who kind of sometimes allied with each other against another, sometimes were actively all opposed to one another. At this point in time, Philip Schuyler was in the seat of power, and they were talking about him as a stooge of Hamilton. They thought that Philip Schuyler was essentially a placeholder for Hamilton to have that seat of power. So they didn't trust that Philip Schuyler was actually his own man. They thought that this Alexander Hamilton guy, who's already one of the most powerful members of the executive branch of the government, is also involved in representing us in the Senate. And so they were like, this is scary, this is dangerous. So the Clintons and Livingstons united at this point in time to promote someone to challenge Philip Schuyler.
Yeah, and Burr's kind of a shoo-in in this because he's not an extreme on either side. He's a moderate here. So he's easy to kind of fit wherever he needs to be fit into. So he can easily get votes.
Yeah, so he's the most active politician who could actually have no identifiable party correlation. We've talked in our previous episode about Aaron Burr, whether he's a villain or a hero or whatever, about how he was very much an extreme moderate in everything. Right. He was very much trying to be that person who pulled together all sides and tried to get wisdom from every area in order to make the best decision. At least that's how he wanted us to think of his positions. And so he wanted to be seen as this person that was respectful of all sides, all positions. And so here you see that the Clintons and the Livingstons put forward this guy, Aaron Burr, and they say that this is the one we want to challenge Philip Schuyler for his seat. And so people in the Clinton camp could look back at the Clinton administration, and no, not the Bill Clinton administration that you're thinking of, but the George Clinton administration as governor of the New York colony at the time, and they could say that there was a time when Aaron Burr was actually the attorney general for Clinton. So they looked at him as someone that was a lawyer who represented them well. He had aligned himself with the Clintons fairly well to at least be recognizable to the Clintonians. And then he also was recognizable to the Livingstons because of his involvement with a lot of the banks and a lot of the things in the area. And so the Livingstons and the Clintons kind of rallied behind this opponent of Schuyler.
Yeah.
And one of the quotes that we've mentioned before is how in New York politics, this was someone named James Parton, a 19th century biographer, who said this about their factions. And he said, the Clintons had power. They had been governor for a long time. They had power. The Livingstons had numbers because their families had populated a lot of the area. There were a lot of people that were represented as the populist party in New York. And then the Schuylers had Hamilton. And he was a force unto himself. Yeah. So Hamilton was the Schuyler's weapon that was on par with the power of the Clintons and the numbers of the Livingstons. Mm-hmm. But at this point, the power and the numbers teamed up against Hamilton's faction, put forward Aaron Burr, and unseated Hamilton's father-in-law.
Yeah. So they choose old extra medium Aaron Burr, and he says to Hamilton, oh, Wall Street thinks you're great. You'll always be adored by the things that you create. Anachronistic there because Wall Street didn't exist yet. It was just a residential area. But then Hamilton says, wait, almost like he's calling for Burr to go back to his old philosophy. Go back to wait for it. You're moving too fast. You're against me now. You're having all this action. I need you to wait for it. Hold on. Wait again. It was easy for me to overcome you then. And Burr continues saying, people think you're crooked. Schuyler's seat was up for grabs and I took it. And Hamilton would kind of get his revenge here. Schuyler would actually beat out Burr for his seat back again in the next Senate election in 1797 after the Federalists took New York State Senate.
Yeah, so the seat of power was kind of transitioning back and forth quite a bit there, and Hamilton didn't really lose political sway until he was no longer on the scene to have political sway. He was always kind of involved with everyone that was kind of a Hamiltonian fan, a Hamilton fan. So he always had those places of power and the recognizable Hamilton name. Even after the Washington administration, after he left the Washington administration, he still was able to influence politics just by writing letters, by writing pamphlets, by sending information out there, which is probably why when Burr heard that Hamilton had said something against his own reputation, he was so adamant that Hamilton retracted, which we will talk about later on when we discuss the origins of their duel. But to talk about where this political feud is kind of starting here, Hamilton looks at Burr in this song and he says, after this betrayal, he says, I've always considered you a friend.
And Burr's like, I don't see why that has to end. Whether he sees it or not, it does end here.
It does. And one of the things that Nancy Eisenberg pulls out in her controversial but very well-researched and well-written book called Fallen Founder, The Life of Aaron Burr. We talked about it in our Aaron Burr episode number 5, if you want to go back and listen to it now. One of the things she pulls out is that every time that Hamilton actively, personally attacks Burr, Burr always responds with a political argument. Right. He keeps things professional. He tries not to get down in the mud and trying not to do any mudslinging or name-calling. He tries not to go down that route. He tries to keep things professional, and he thinks that even if I'm on the opposite side of the aisle, even if I'm someone who is representing in court the opposite position, I'm still going to be respectful at every dinner party. I'm still going to be kind, visiting people for dinner and visiting people that can be my friends personally, even if politically we have these different disagreements. So he has that very nonpartisan mindset that a lot of millennials want to relate to. So Burr's very much a millennial hero where he's talking about, like, there's no absolutes here. Let's just kind of go with whatever happens. And then specifically here, we can still be friends even though we disagree a little bit. He has that diversity of opinions. Hamilton doesn't see it that way. He sees it as a personal slight that is very much pitting them against one another, which they've always kind of been against one another, but Hamilton's always won.
Right.
Here, they're against each other, and Burr wins, and Hamilton is flustered.
Yeah, it's almost like Hamilton saying, well, I can be friends with you as long as I'm on top, as long as I'm the one that's winning, but everything that Hamilton believes is tied so closely to who he is that he could not be that person who sits down and has dinner friendly with someone who disagrees with him politically, because it's to the very core of who he is. And Hamilton's kind of being a little bit of a hypocrite here by saying, oh, you change parties to run against my father-in-law? Because we're just coming off a song where Hamilton himself went into the room where it happens and made some dealings behind closed doors. So it's not like he hasn't done this type of thing. The only difference really is that Hamilton wasn't compromising his underlying principles by making this deal, while Burr casually switching parties makes him seem kind of like he has no principles, which is going to come up again.
Right, that's an attack that Hamilton levels against Burr all the time, that he doesn't stand for anything. He doesn't stand for anything, so he's just completely morally irresponsible, morally untrustworthy. That's why he ends up supporting Thomas Jefferson instead of Burr, because we at least know what Thomas Jefferson stood for. But in this moment, you see that Hamilton's pride has been challenged, and he is no longer on top. He had risen to power, he had risen to fame, he had risen to prominence, and he had just come out of the success of finding a compromise that would get his debt plan, his assumption plan on the table to go through Congress. He had made these victorious steps, and then his father-in-law loses his seat. Hamilton loses his influence in the Senate through that one seat, and Burr looks at him and acknowledges that pride that Hamilton has, and he says, I swear, your pride will be the death of us all.
Beware, it goeth before the fall. Bringing up that proverb.
Yeah, my parents always quoted the Proverbs to us when we were growing up. That was one of the Proverbs that they said, that pride goeth before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall, which I didn't know what haughty spirit meant. I thought it was just like, oh, a haughty is in the Bible somewhere? No, it was spelled differently.
So that takes us to the end of our song here.
And one thing I love about the end of this song is that it perfectly flows into the next song.
Yeah.
That this, staging-wise, Hamilton is standing there with his arms crossed, watching Burr. He doesn't uncross his arms the whole time when he's staring at Burr, so angry about this interaction, this slight against his own family. And he's so angry and he's so frustrated. And then, like, the stage changes around him. People bring out the chairs, they line him up around him, and he is facing Burr. Burr steps back and sits down, and Jefferson steps up. Hamilton's still standing there in place with his arms crossed, angry. He had been attacking Burr. Now he's going to face his other opponent, Thomas Jefferson, in cabinet battle number 2. The stage has been set around him. He is frustrated. He is flustered. He's ready to start calling some names, and he's ready to get down and dirty, slinging the mud at Thomas Jefferson in cabinet battle number 2, which I'm excited to unpack next week.
Yeah, gonna have to wait for next week for that one. We are out of time here.
Yes, we are. So by way of closing, we have a couple of resources we want you to check out, some recommendations we have that'll kind of tie you over until next Tuesday when we drop the next episode. The first thing I noticed was when I walked through the checkout at the register, the National Geographic History issue from May and June actually has a very familiar face on the front of it, and it says, History, Hamilton, America's hottest founding father. I thought it was just a funny little headline. And it has the bust of Alexander Hamilton on the front of this cover. If you're interested in a concise magazine-length article about how Hamilton rose to power and rose to fame and what happened in his life, this actually has some really neat points. I picked it up at the register and I thought, like, I need to read it, just see what's in here. It has some good moments, and if you are trying to share this with people and you want to share the history of Hamilton with them, but they're not going to read the Chernow biography, they're not going to pick up the Nancy Eisenberg's book about Burr, they're just going to read a magazine, hand them this. This is actually a good resource. It shows them the history, lets them know how cool some of the things he had to overcome were, and how interesting his story was.
Right, and it is a little bit pricey. It's actually, ironically, $10.
It costs a Hamilton to get a Hamilton.
Yeah, Hamilton to get a Hamilton. The second piece of news is that the podcast that Robbie guested on, the Real Weird Sisters Harry Potter podcast, is actually up now. So you can go hear him talk with them about which houses the Hamilton characters would be sorted into.
Right, and I'm almost nervous for some of you to go in there because I know that some of you are going to be disagreeing with me. I know I have a very contentious, very, very different point of view on a couple of the characters. I'm interested in seeing how many people agree with me on Hercules Mulligan, John Adams, and specifically our title character. I'm not going to give anything away, but if you go look at the Real Weird Sisters podcast, you can listen to the conversation I had with Martha and Alice on their podcast, and you can see what we did to sort all of the major sisters, all of the major characters, all the major actors and the founding fathers in their Hogwarts houses, and I think you'll enjoy it. So go to the Real Weird Sisters podcast, check them out, hit them up on Twitter, Real Weird Sister, and check out their website, realweirdSisters.com. It's really neat, and I think I'm really interested in hearing whether any of you agree with me on where we sorted some of those characters.
So if you'd like to get into contact with us, remember to email contact@graphocast.com or on Twitter @graphocast. And remember our Patreon page. If you'd like to contribute to the show and get some exclusives, that's patreon.com/graphocast, GRAPHOCAST. And if you'd like to get in touch with us on our personal Twitters, I'm @FleshEater.
And I'm @Alpha Knight.
So until next week, I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker.
See you in the next cabinet battle. Hi, Vinton Bayne here again for a real quick announcement. The Graphomania Podcast Network has a new podcast, Read Brave Comics, a comics podcast where your hosts, Corey Casto and I, will introduce you to a wide variety of segments about the world of comic books, some of which will include segments by me and Robbie from this very Hamilton podcast. Check it out now on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, or at graphocast.com, GRAPHOCAST.com. That's Read Brave Comics.